Imagine you are born, you take your first breath, and the world around you is already ending. Not metaphorically, literally. The sky above your village has turned the color of a bruise. The harvests have failed for the third year in a row. The person who delivered you is already coughing. There is a year in human history, one specific year, where surviving it was nearly a miracle. A year so catastrophically, so cosmically bad, that one historian called it simply the worst year to be alive. But here's what nobody tells you. It wasn't a war, it wasn't a plague, it wasn't even a human choice, and it changed the entire trajectory of civilization. This is the story of 536 AD. To understand what happened, you need to feel what the world was like before it. It's spring in the year 535 AD. In Constantinople, the beating heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, merchants are trading silks from China. Farmers in Europe are watching green fields push through the soil. In Mesoamerica, cities are humming. In China, the Tang dynasty's predecessors are consolidating power. The world is not perfect. The world has never been perfect. But it is alive. It is functioning. It has rhythm. Then something happened. Something no human could have predicted, stopped, or explained. In early 536, people across the entire known world began reporting the same thing. An extraordinary, unexplainable darkness. Not nighttime, not clouds. Something else entirely. A thick, fog-like veil that had descended over the sun itself. The Roman historian Procopius wrote, and these are his actual words, that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for 18 months. 18 months where the sun rose every day and gave humanity almost no warmth. Temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. That doesn't sound like much. Until you realize that a 1-degree drop is enough to shorten growing seasons, a 2-degree drop collapses them entirely. But that wasn't even the worst year. The worst was still coming. For centuries, nobody knew what caused it. People at the time thought it was a punishment from God. Astronomers in later centuries speculated it was a comet, a volcanic eruption, a curse. It took a 2018 analysis of an ancient glacier in the Swiss Alps to finally give us the answer. Scientists drilled deep into the ice, deep enough to reach air bubbles and volcanic ash trapped from 1500 years ago, and found something extraordinary. A massive volcanic eruption in Iceland had blasted millions of tons of ash and sulfurous gas into the upper atmosphere, and it had essentially wrapped the entire planet in a reflective blanket, bouncing sunlight back into space. The world hadn't been punished by God. It had been suffocated by a mountain that decided to explode at the worst possible moment. But here is where history gets genuinely disturbing. The crop failures began in 536. Summer temperatures in some regions dropped so low that snow fell in China in August. Droughts followed in Peru. Famines swept from Ireland to Mesopotamia. In China, historical records describe a yellow dust falling from the sky like snow. In Egypt, the Nile failed to flood. The very heartbeat of civilization in that region broken. People were starving, not in isolated pockets, everywhere, simultaneously. But then something strange happened. Just as humanity was starting to recover, just as the skies were beginning to clear, the second blow landed. In 541 AD, 5 years into the famine, a new catastrophe arrived. The plague of Justinian, the first great bubonic plague pandemic in recorded history, exploded out of Egypt and tore through the Mediterranean world like fire through dry grass. At its peak, it was killing 5,000 people per day in Constantinople alone. 5,000 per day in a single city. Historians estimate it eventually killed between 25 and 50 million people, roughly half the population of the Byzantine Empire. Some scholars believe it killed between 1/4 and 1/3 of the entire Eastern Roman world. The volcanic darkness that had starved the world had also weakened it, made it immunologically fragile, malnourished, desperate. And into that vulnerable moment, the plague arrived like a second sword. Here is the part that almost nobody talks about. When scientists examined that Swiss glacier, that frozen record of ancient atmosphere, they found something haunting in the ice from around 640 AD, just after this century of catastrophes. The lead levels in the air dropped to almost zero. Lead in this era was a byproduct of silver smelting. Silver smelting meant economic activity, workshops, trade, people buying and selling things. The near-zero lead in the ice means that for a period after 536, Europe's economy essentially flatlined. The workshops went silent, the trade routes emptied, civilization, in measurable chemical terms, almost stopped. This is where everything changed. Archaeologists have a name for this period. They call it the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a prolonged cold snap lasting from roughly 536 to 660 AD, over a century, triggered by those volcanic eruptions, sustained by others that followed. A century of cold, of plague, of failed harvests, of collapsing empires. Some historians now believe this climatic catastrophe played a direct role in the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, the collapse of the Sasanian Persian Empire, the weakening of empires across Central Asia, and the rise of new powers, including the rapid early expansion of Islam in the mid-600s, spreading into a world that had been geopolitically shattered by a century of climate disaster. A volcano in Iceland may have, indirectly, reshaped the entire religious and political map of the world we live in today. But this isn't really a story about a volcano, or a plague, or a medieval famine. This is a story about fragility. We have built an entire civilization on the assumption of stability. We plant crops in the expectation of sun. We build supply chains across oceans in the expectation of functioning ports. We raise children in the expectation that the world will more or less cooperate. The people of 536 AD had the same expectations. They had built their world carefully. Cities, roads, trade routes, governments, churches. They had accumulated knowledge, culture, art. They had solved problems their parents hadn't been able to solve. They believed they were progressing. And then the sky changed color, and none of it mattered. Think about what that does to a person psychologically, not just the starvation, the confusion, the complete inability to explain what is happening. People in 536 had no understanding of volcanic aerosols. They had no satellites, no ice core data, no climate models. They just knew that the sun had gone dim, and they didn't know why, and they didn't know when or if it would end. There is a particular kind of terror in that. Not the terror of knowing something terrible is coming, but the terror of living inside a catastrophe you cannot name. We think we are immune to that now. We tell ourselves that science protects us. That knowledge protects us. That our complex, interlocked systems of global civilization are robust enough to absorb any shock. And this is the part that should stay with you. The people of 535 AD thought exactly the same thing. Here is what survival looked like in 536 AD. It looked like a farmer in what is now Ireland, pressing seeds into cold, hard ground, not knowing whether they'd grow. It looked like a mother in Constantinople boiling leather to feed her children. It looked like a monk in a darkened monastery, writing down what was happening, not because anyone asked him to, but because something in him refused to let the world disappear without a record. It looked like ordinary people, surviving an extraordinary catastrophe, not because they were prepared, they weren't, but because human beings have this strange, irrational, almost absurd compulsion to keep going. 536 AD is not just history's darkest year. It is a mirror that shows you what civilization is actually made of when everything stable is stripped away. Not infrastructure, not institutions, not knowledge or wealth or power, just people, planting seeds in cold ground and hoping. The sun went dark for 18 months. The crops failed. The empires cracked. The plague came. And still, somehow, we are here. Which means the question isn't whether humanity can survive its worst year. The question is, what do we do with the years we've been given since?